original release in 1999, Final Fantasy VIII proved to be both a critically appreciated game, but also one that was very divisive among those whom had played it at the time. Since then, in the years and decades since, there has been many re-evaluations or interpretations of the game, as well as the facts and rumors that occurred and were learned about during its development and creation. Before the release of Final Fantasy VIII, the video game market was still speaking about the original Final Fantasy VII, which had been released 2 years previously in the year of 1997. The developmental origins of Final Fantasy VIII began roughly during the English translation of Final Fantasy VII. Interior development of Final Fantasy VIII actually had a fair amount of problems and controversies due to the groundbreaking circumstances of Final Fantasy VII's conceivement. Final Fantasy VII was the first Final Fantasy game that most Western video gamers had experienced, and with that experience, game expectations. Square was under intense pressure to come up with a game that was virtually identical to Final Fantasy VII, but different at the same time for a new experience. Even among its developers, there were arguments about which path the game should take in terms of plot for the story, relationship and interactions of characters, and even sub-themed elements within the game. Notable examples were the emphasis of the Triple Triad, a card collecting game within Final Fantasy VIII that some critics felt at the time were too forced upon players to engage with. For details that there were even scenarios where gamers didn't really necessarily want to play the Triple Triad and rather focus on the actual gaming experience, but later in the game, where certain tasks were required to use the card game, some were left at a disadvantage due to not playing the card game early on and getting required cards or beneficial cards for playing against non-player characters in the game. In terms of details within the story, it's also known that Rinoa and Cypher were once in a relationship. Cypher even mentioned that the both of them were physically intimate, but it wasn't mentioned much by the other characters in the game due to lack of knowledge of the relationship in detail, and desire by Rinoa for it to be forgotten and not to be ever mentioned again. Magic was also absorbed from enemies. You couldn't just have magic to cast naturally as depicted in other Final Fantasy games. It needed to be drawn, and a stock of the amount of spells would be kept by the player to use as needed or desired. If the amount of spells were at 0, it couldn't be used, and the player had to venture to an area where enemies that had the spell to draw from were located. Later in the game, the player would naturally have enough stock of spells to use, as depicted and mentioned, but early on in the game, depending on the situation or scenario, it might be difficult or even annoying for them to play due to lack of spell selection for enemies or bosses. Summons were also something of contention, as in this particular version of Final Fantasy, they were called Guardian Forces, as these forces needed to be charged up in order to attack the enemies during the march. The force would be in front of the player during charge, so theoretically if an attack by an enemy were of sufficient health point damage, the summon would be knocked out for the march and unable to be used for the rest of that said march. The concept of summoning would not be truly changed until Final Fantasy X, released in 2001, where the summon would emerge and attack alongside the player at the same time, but with no charging time. Some gamers complained about the fact that the charge time was something of contention because there was no instantaneous attack for the summon to use against opponents, and if the summon were to be defeated before the charge was done, then all of that was for naught. The story of the game were also something of contention and frustration that divided players due to the sheer complexity of the game, as details with relation to lore were somewhat hard and convoluted for casual gamers to understand. The story of Final Fantasy VIII was actually considered by gamers to be the worst, or enjoy the least, out of any Final Fantasy game until X2 was published in 2003. As mentioned, the story and plot were sources of contention and frustration by developers of the game on later reactions from the players whom had experienced it. Details of the game were so vague or complex that even some formulated theories about moments within the game to better understand it, or to help explain certain depictions or situations that they did not fully understand. These theories have persisted in some form since the game's original release. These theories have either been proven or disproven since the original game's release. Either they be true or untrue with these rumors, but due to the complexity of the stories, players made these observations. Some players got impressions from the game that through details and features from Rinoa and Ultimisia, they had them being one and the same person, but at different times or points in their lives. An important fact of the story is that later on it involves time travel. Some players assumed that these two characters were connected, but it could also mean that simply by the gaming technology at the time that there were not a lot in terms of details for the character models to be presented. And some assumed that Rinoa was a younger version of Ultimisia. This happened to be something of a personal opinion among some players, but enough of these players held this particular view in mind in terms of a connection between Rinoa and Ultimisia that this gained support from others when this theory became discussed online with relation to the game, due to similar impressions that other players might have had, as other players who were more influenced by theories of the game started to agree that there might be a connection between Rinoa and Ultimisia which might exist in such a way. One of the most confusing examples, which wasn't technically explained in the game, is that during the final cutscenes of the game, Rinoa's white angelic wings turn black and devilish like Ultimisia, which suggests a possible connection to Ultimisia, and that this particular scene is hard to disprove by those who claim that there is no connection between these two characters, in confirmation to those who think there might be some sort of connection. Why would such an image be seen? Was it a trick or hallucination due to the time compression? The theory went further in connecting the depiction of Rinoa's wings to the infamous assumption of Squall's death. Griever was mentioned through the game as a guardian force only a few times in conversations, or some players might not have put much thought into it. But Griever was mostly well known for being depicted in the end of the game when Ultimisia junctioned herself to it during the final battle. In-game information had it that the summon belonged to a royal family, and the ring was that Squall owned contained the summon, as it was an heirloom from his family as he mentioned it. Despite the fact that the rumors at the time had it that Griever was a secret summon that was able to be used within game, more secret than Eden in terms of difficulty to obtain, there were no ways to naturally get the summon in the game through regular play. Ultimisia, through circumstances in the game, stole the ring from Squall, and that's how she was able to junction it to her and use her magic to enhance the summon and use it against the party in the final battle. But connecting the theory that Griever and Squall, or Rinoa and Ultimisia, being somehow connected, is that the light beneath her during the summoning had it that the Guardian might have already been within her, not obtained when Ultimecia stole the ring from Squall. Assumptions had it that if Ultimecia used the Guardian Force before the second phase of the final battle, that the light would have been on Squall, not Ultimecia. But if Squall had given the Guardian Force to Rinoa, and she later transformed into Ultimecia, why would she try to kill Squall, Rinoa, and the others in the final battle? Theories further mention that it could have been due to memory deterioration, due to an overuse of Guardian Forces through junctioning, a detail only mentioned in passing a few times in the game, notably towards the beginning of the game when the conversation is first brought up in terms of Guardian Forces and their abilities, with Squall and Quistis with relation to Ifrit. Squall's resolve to protect Rinoa was confirmed, as he felt strongly about her towards the end of the game, but never said out loud but merely within his thoughts. As he mentioned, due to the stigma of a woman being the sorceress which Rinoa later became, he would still protect her. Adia mentioned that if Rinoa had someone to rely on, as herself being a previous example of a sorceress with Sid, then Rinoa and Squall could both keep the powers of the sorceress under control. Adia also mentioned that Ultimecia had no one for emotional support, and this was damaging to her mental stability with control over her powers and abilities. As again, this could all be interpreted as an alternate way of how they are viewed from the game. Our sorceresses, depending on the sorceress in discussion, were viewed favorably or unfavorably depending on what they did with their powers. The most extreme theories presented it that Squall had become Griever himself. At the moment of his death, he became a Guardian Force by representation of his mind through his talents and junction to Rinoa/Ultimecia to stay with her after his death. But with all of the circumstances from powers to decay, death, loneliness, and an unknown amount of time from the present to the far future in Final Fantasy VIII could have easily driven Rinoa mad. As in the game, Ultimecia often wondered from dialogue when the last time that she was truly happy and why she was angry, to be exact. She could have easily forgotten why. The theory explains the reason for the time compression, that Rinoa/Ultimecia desired the past where and when she was happy and forced it to the future where she was miserable in an attempt to remember better times of her life. The giant castle where Ultimecia resides is actually located where Squall and Rinoa promised to meet one another again, as per details in the game. The desire to meet again could have been so great that Ultimecia/Rinoa could have created the castle at that particular location in an attempt to meet Squall once more. What was also a bizarre detail is that if the players did not obtain all of the Guardian Forces through progression of the game, they were all available during the castle venture in the final area of the game. The online theories connect this with the fact that if Rinoa eventually became Ultimecia, she'd be the last one out of anyone within the group, and she would have obtained all of the Guardian Forces from the others that had died through old age or miscellaneous circumstances. The monsters that held the forces through the castle were repressed versions of the Guardian Forces that Ultimecia/Rinoa had remembered and used in her previous life. When Rinoa was partially absorbed by Adele, and later rescued from the absorption, it could have easily been that some of the evil from Adele was transferred to Rinoa and she might have not known about it. Sorceresses need the support of their knights or loved ones to avoid having no emotional support as Adele and Ultimecia ended up as. The latent evilness from Adele could have emerged into Rinoa at a later time, or no one might have suspected or noticed such an emergence. The death of Squall Lionheart isn't as monumental as some might imagine, as the theory concludes that during the first confrontation with Adia, and her casting that particular spell, it actually impales Squall in his shoulder near his chest, and he dies from his injuries. Everything that occurred from that point onwards, chronologically within the game, were hallucinations of his final moments of life. How Squall was healed of these life-ending wounds were only mentioned a few times after it had occurred, or never again. Theorists mention that before the quote-unquote death, the plot of the game were that it was logically based and factual, but after the quote-unquote death, it became exotically based and imaginary. The concept of Sade, Tears Point, Lunatic Pandora, the Sorceresses, Time Compression, Ultimisia as a sorceress, Adele, Renoa as a sorceress, everything were considered and viewed as hallucinations. Before Ultimisia's true and final death, she begins to say things that doesn't make much sense. These comments are actually directed at Squall and aren't meant to make sense to the others listening, unless she was telling him that he should accept his own death, that this is breaking the fourth wall, and that the illusion that Squall has during his death by Adia. But this could have been comments by Ultimisia to Squall as the time compression disappeared, and everything returned to its normal state within the timeline. But what's eerie is that in the final moments of the game, one of the scenes is that of the orphanage, and at the exact moment of Ultimisia's death, she collapses, and the power of the sorceress transfers from her to Adia, meaning that everything in the game had already happened. How and why would everything connect in such a way? A partial or fully complete loop. How could such a thing exist? Why would such a thing exist? Some could not understand that and use these fan theories to compensate for the lack of understanding. With everything considered, most of these fan speculations are quite imaginary when compared to their original depictions, but the plot and story for Final Fantasy VIII were exotic as these fan theories were. Due to the fact that the story was so convoluted from its development by Square to developer implementation and gamer interpretation, it's easy to imagine how these theories would emerge, and how Final Fantasy VIII could have been misunderstood by some, but known by all, and that is undoubtedly a fact and hardly a rumor.